Eira, you're being terminated for insubordination and failure to follow direct orders, Lysander Hayes said, sliding the termination paperwork across his mahogany desk with the coldness of someone swatting a fly. Security will escort you out. In 10 minutes. I sat there, stunned, watching 3 years of dedicated service crumble in seconds. 3 years of staying late, covering for his mistakes, and keeping my mouth shut about things that would have destroyed his career. But I'd made one fatal error. I'd reported safety violations to the company's whistleblower hotline, thinking it would be handled quietly and professionally. What Lysander didn't know was that every call to that hotline was recorded. And what he definitely didn't know was that I had obtained a copy of my own recording, a recording that captured him in the background during my call, explicitly instructing his assistant to get rid of that troublemaker before I'd even finished speaking. That recording would change everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The termination letter felt like ice in my hands as I stared at the corporate letterhead of Blackstone Pharmaceuticals, the same logo I'd been proud to wear on my lab coat for 3 years. The words blurred together as my vision tunneled: gross insubordination, failure to maintain professional conduct, immediate termination effective today. Lysander sat back in his leather chair, fingers steepled like some corporate villain from a bad movie, waiting for me to speak. The silence stretched between us, filled only by the hum of the air conditioning and the distant sounds of the research facility continuing its work without me. I don't understand, I finally managed, my voice barely above a whisper. My performance reviews have been exemplary. Dr. Kinsley King just approved my research proposal last month. The Morrison trial results I compiled exceeded all projected outcomes by 40%. Lysander's mouth twitched in what might have been amusement. Performance reviews don't account for attitude problems, Eira. Your recent behavior has been concerning. Concerning? The word came out sharper than I intended, and I watched his eyebrows raise slightly. Even now, even as he was destroying my career, I was proving his point about my so-called insubordination. The incident last week, he said, opening a file on his desk with theatrical precision. When you questioned my decision regarding the Phase 3 protocols, in front of the entire review board. My heart sank as I remembered that meeting. I'd spent 2 weeks identifying serious flaws in the proposed testing methodology, flaws that could have led to inaccurate results, or worse, compromised patient safety. When Lysander had dismissed my concerns without even reviewing my data, I'd spoken up. Politely, professionally, but firmly. Those weren't questions, those were legitimate safety concerns, I said, fighting to keep my voice steady. The dosage calculations were off by a factor that could have what? Lysander leaned forward, his voice taking on a dangerous edge. Cost the company millions in delays? Undermined months of work by suggesting my team doesn't know what they're doing. Could have hurt people, I finished quietly, the words hung in the air between us like a challenge. In the pharmaceutical industry, patient safety was supposed to be paramount. It was the first thing they taught you, the last thing you thought about before leaving work each day. But sitting in Lysander's office, surrounded by his awards and accolades, I realized that patient safety was just another corporate buzzword when it conflicted with timeline pressures and profit margins. You see? Lysander gestured at me as if I'd just proven his entire case. This is exactly what I'm talking about. This attitude that you know better than everyone else. This refusal to trust the expertise of your superiors. I wanted to argue, to point out that I'd spent 4 years earning my doctorate in biochemistry, that I'd published 12 papers on pharmaceutical safety protocols, that my dissertation on drug interaction analysis had been cited in 3 major journals. But what was the point? Lysander had made his decision before I'd even walked into his office. The incident you're referring to, I said carefully, when I raised concerns about the Phase 3 protocols, that led me to contact the company's whistleblower hotline. As per corporate policy. The change in Lysander's expression was instantaneous. The practiced corporate sympathy vanished, replaced by something cold and calculating. Yes, he said slowly. About that. He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a small digital recorder, setting it on the desk between us like a weapon. Company policy requires all whistleblower calls to be recorded for quality assurance and legal protection. Did you know that? I nodded, not trusting my voice. Of course I knew that. It was stated clearly in the employee handbook, repeated in every compliance training session. Good, Lysander said, his fingers drumming against the recorder. Then you'll understand that your call last Tuesday has been thoroughly reviewed by our legal team and myself. The conclusion was unanimous. Your concerns were based on incomplete data and reflected a fundamental misunderstanding of our established protocols. That's not. Furthermore, he continued, raising his voice to cut me off, your decision to go around proper channels instead of working within the established hierarchy demonstrates exactly the kind of insubordinate behavior that makes you unsuitable for continued employment. I felt something crumble inside my chest. 3 years of my life, countless late nights, missed dinners, cancelled plans, all of it dismissed because I'd tried to do the right thing. Because I'd seen something dangerous and spoken up about it. The Morrison trial, I said desperately. The results I compiled, they'll need someone to present the findings to the FDA review board next month. Dr. Corliss Hayes from our Boston facility will be taking over your projects, Lysander said, already reaching for his phone. She's far more experienced with regulatory presentations. Corliss Hayes. I knew her by reputation, brilliant, ambitious, and absolutely ruthless when it came to advancing her career. She'd take credit for my 3 years of work on the Morrison trial without blinking, and probably get promoted for it. Security will be here in 5 minutes to escort you out, Lysander said, his attention already shifting to his computer screen. HR will contact you about COBRA benefits and your final paycheck. Please don't make this more difficult than it needs to be. I sat there for another moment, staring at this man who held my entire career in his hands. Lysander Hayes, Director of Research Development, the youngest department head in Blackstone's history. The golden boy who'd fast-tracked to his position. Through a combination of charisma, strategic networking, and an uncanny ability to take credit for other people's work while deflecting blame for his own mistakes. Is there anything else? He asked without looking up. No, I said quietly, standing on unsteady legs. I think you've said enough. As I walked toward the door, my hand on the brass handle, I heard him pick up his phone and dial an extension. Brianna? It's done. Yes, she's leaving now. No, she took it better than expected. Just make sure Dr. Hayes has all the Morrison files transferred by tomorrow morning. I paused, my hand frozen on the door handle. Something about his tone, about the casual way he was already moving on, made my stomach turn. This wasn't a difficult decision for him. This was just another Tuesday afternoon task, crossed off his endless to-do list. The security guard who escorted me out was at least kind enough to let me pack my personal items without watching over my shoulder. As I emptied my desk drawers into a cardboard box, the same kind of box I'd used to move into this office 3 years ago, I thought about the whistleblower recording sitting in some HR file cabinet. What Lysander didn't know, what nobody at Blackstone knew, was that I'd requested a copy of my own recording from the compliance department. Standard procedure, they'd told me. Every employee had the right to review any recordings of their own calls. What none of them knew was what that recording actually contained. Because while I'd been on hold, waiting for the compliance officer to pick up, Lysander had walked into his assistant's office directly outside the compliance department. And the recording had captured every word of his conversation with Brianna Croft about getting rid of the troublemaker who dared to question his protocols. That recording was currently sitting in my purse, along with 3 years' worth of carefully documented safety concerns that Lysander had dismissed, buried, or outright ignored. As I carried my box through the lobby of Blackstone Pharmaceuticals for the last time, I wasn't thinking about unemployment benefits or job searches. I was thinking about justice, and how sometimes it comes in the form of a 20-minute audio file that nobody bothered to review before handing it over. That recording would change everything. I just didn't know how much. That was 4 months ago. But I suppose I should properly introduce myself before I tell you how I brought down one of the most powerful research directors in the pharmaceutical industry. Hi, I'm Eira Vance, 31 years old, and until recently, I was what most people in corporate America would call a model employee. The scientist who worked weekends without overtime pay. The researcher who double-checked everyone else's calculations and quietly fixed their mistakes. The person who said yes when asked to cover for absent colleagues, who stayed silent when others took credit for her work, and who genuinely believed that hard work and integrity would eventually be rewarded. If you're watching this, you probably found me through the algorithm, maybe searching for stories about workplace retaliation or whistleblower protections. I never imagined I'd be the kind of person making videos like this, but when your entire career gets destroyed by one vindictive director, you learn that sometimes telling your story is the only way to reclaim your power. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Before we go any further, if this resonates with you so far, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. And if you've ever experienced retaliation for speaking up about safety concerns or ethical violations, share your story in the comments below. I read every single one, and honestly, discovering how common these experiences are has been both heartbreaking and empowering. Now, let me tell you who I really was before Lysander Hayes decided to destroy my life. I grew up in Millbrook Heights, a small town about 2 hours north of the city, where my parents ran a family pharmacy that had been in business for 30 years. My earliest memories are of standing behind the prescription counter, watching my father carefully measure medications and explain drug interactions to elderly customers who trusted him with their lives. My mother, a former nurse, would spend hours with customers who couldn't afford their medications, helping them find assistance programs or alternative treatments. That pharmacy taught me that medicine isn't just about science, it's about people. Real people with real problems who depend on you to get things right. When I was 12, Mrs. Henderson from down the street came in with a prescription that would have interacted dangerously with her heart medication. My father caught the error and called her doctor, probably saving her life. I'll never forget what he told me that day. In this business, being right isn't enough. You have to be brave enough to speak up when something's wrong. Those words shaped everything I did afterward. I earned my bachelor's degree in biochemistry from Thornfield University on a full academic scholarship, graduated summa cum laude, and went straight into their doctoral program. My dissertation focused on drug interaction analysis in elderly patients, inspired, of course, by growing up in that pharmacy. I spent 4 years researching how medications behave differently in aging bodies, how standard dosages can become dangerous when combined with other treatments, and how pharmaceutical companies often overlook these interactions in their rush to market. My research was published in the Journal of Pharmaceutical Safety, cited in congressional hearings about drug approval processes, and earned me early admission to Blackstone Pharmaceuticals' prestigious research fellowship program. At 28, I was the youngest researcher they'd ever hired directly into their clinical trials division. I thought I was living my dream. For 3 years, I threw myself into my work at Blackstone with the same dedication my parents had shown in their pharmacy. I arrived early, stayed late, and treated every project like lives depended on getting it right, because they did. The Morrison trial I'd been leading was developing a new treatment for early-stage Alzheimer's, something that could help millions of families avoid the devastating progression I'd watched my own grandmother endure. I was good at my job. Really good. My safety protocols were adopted as company standards. My data analysis methods improved trial accuracy by 23%. I'd identified and prevented 4 potentially dangerous drug interactions that other researchers had missed. In any reasonable workplace, I would have been promoted, recognized, rewarded for this kind of contribution. Instead, I was seen as a problem. You see, pharmaceutical research exists in a delicate balance between scientific integrity and business pressure. Clinical trials cost millions of dollars and take years to complete. Every delay, every additional safety check, every request for more data costs money and pushes back potential profits. In that environment, researchers who consistently raise safety concerns, even legitimate ones, become inconvenient. Lysander Hayes was hired as research director 2 years into my tenure, brought in specifically to streamline operations and accelerate time to market for promising treatments. He was everything I wasn't: charismatic, politically savvy, and absolutely brilliant at managing up while managing down with an iron fist. Within 6 months, he'd restructured the entire department, replacing methodical safety protocols with aggressive timelines and efficiency metrics. I should have seen the writing on the wall when Dr. Ragnar Reed, our former safety compliance officer, was quietly transferred to a consulting role after questioning some of Lysander's accelerated testing protocols. Or when Phelan Reed from Quality Assurance was suddenly reassigned to a different division after raising concerns about data manipulation in the Hendricks trial. But I believed in the system. I believed that if I documented everything properly, followed all the right procedures, and presented my concerns through official channels, someone would listen. Someone would care that we were cutting corners on safety protocols for drugs that would eventually be prescribed to vulnerable patients. I was incredibly naive. The final straw came during the Phase 3 review for the Morrison trial. I'd spent weeks analyzing the preliminary data and discovered that the dosage calculations for patients over 75 were based on flawed assumptions about kidney function in aging populations. The error wasn't dramatic. Most patients would probably be fine, but for a subset with existing kidney problems, the standard dose could cause serious complications. When I presented this finding to Lysander privately, he dismissed it without even reviewing my data. "We're already 6 months behind schedule," he told me. "The FDA won't require age-specific dosing until Phase 4 monitoring anyway. We'll adjust the labeling if problems arise in post-market surveillance." That's when I knew I had to make the call to the Whistleblower Hotline. In my family's pharmacy, "We'll fix it if problems arise," wasn't an acceptable approach to patient safety. When Mrs. Henderson's life was at risk, my father didn't wait for post-market surveillance. He picked up the phone and made the call that could save her life. I thought I was following his example. I thought I was doing the right thing. Instead, I was committing career suicide. The person I was before that phone call, the dedicated researcher, the model employee, the woman who believed in doing good work and trusting the system. She died in Lysander's office the day he fired me. What emerged from that meeting was someone I'd never been before, angry, calculating, and absolutely determined to make sure the truth came out, but I'm getting ahead of myself. First, let me tell you about the 3 weeks of hell that followed. My termination, and how I discovered that my problems with Lysander Hayes were just the tip of a very dangerous iceberg. The first week after my termination, I maintained what I can only describe as delusional optimism. I updated my LinkedIn profile, polished my resume, and started reaching out to contacts in the pharmaceutical industry. After all, I had an impressive track record, published research, successful clinical trials, and 3 years of experience at one of the most prestigious pharmaceutical companies in the country. How hard could it be to find another position? The reality hit me like a freight train. I applied to 14 research positions across 6 different companies. Not entry-level positions, I wasn't being unrealistic, but senior researcher. Roles that matched my experience and qualifications. I crafted personalized cover letters, highlighting my expertise in clinical trial safety protocols and my published work on drug interactions in elderly populations. I reached out to former colleagues from graduate school, professors who had recommended me for the Blackstone Fellowship, and researchers I'd collaborated with at industry conferences. The response was deafening silence, not even rejection letters. Just nothing. Applications submitted into the void, emails that went unanswered, phone calls that weren't returned. It was as if Eira Vance had simply ceased to exist in the pharmaceutical research community. By the second week, I started making direct calls to HR departments. That's when I got my first clue about what was really happening. "Dr. Vance," said the recruiter at Meridian Pharmaceuticals, her voice suddenly cool after she'd been warm and enthusiastic for the first 5 minutes of our conversation. "I'm sorry, but upon further review, we don't think you'd be a good fit for our organization. We've decided not to move forward with your application. Can you tell me what concerns you have about my qualifications?" I pressed. "I'd be happy to address any. I'm afraid I can't provide specific feedback. Thank you for your interest in Meridian." The line went dead. The same conversation played out at North Point Biologics, Sterling Research Group, and Hawthorne Laboratories. Initial interest, followed by sudden, inexplicable rejection. It took me another week to piece together what was happening, and when I did, the betrayal cut deeper than losing my job ever could. Lysander had blacklisted me. I discovered this through Dr. Elias Finch, a former Blackstone colleague who'd left the company 6 months earlier to join Pinnacle Pharmaceuticals. We'd kept in touch sporadically, and when I reached out about potential opportunities at Pinnacle, he agreed to meet for coffee. What he told me over lattes at a small cafe downtown shattered whatever remaining faith I had in professional integrity. "Eira, I need to be straight with you," Elias said, glancing around nervously as if Lysander might be lurking behind the potted plants. "Word has gotten around about your departure from Blackstone. Lysander's been very active in the research director network, sharing his version of events." His version? I felt something cold settle in my stomach. "According to him, you were terminated for gross insubordination and failure to follow safety protocols. He's telling people you were a disruptive influence who undermined team cohesion and questioned established procedures without proper justification." I stared at him, speechless. The irony was breathtaking. I was being blacklisted for supposedly ignoring safety protocols when I'd actually been fired for insisting on them. "That's completely false," I managed. "I was fired for reporting legitimate safety concerns through the proper whistleblower channels." Elias nodded sympathetically. "I believe you. But Lysander is very persuasive. And unfortunately, our industry is smaller than people realize. Research directors talk to each other. When someone with Lysander's reputation says you're a problem employee, people listen. What exactly is he telling them? That you have a pattern of making unfounded safety complaints to avoid work deadlines. That you're litigious and likely to cause legal problems for any company that hires you. That your research methods are sloppy and your conclusions are unreliable." Each word felt like a physical blow. 3 years of meticulous work, of staying late to double-check calculations, of putting patient safety above everything else, all of it twisted into evidence of my supposed incompetence and troublemaking nature. "Elias, you know that's not who I am. You've seen my work." "I know," he said quietly. "But I'm just a senior researcher. I don't have hiring authority, and even if I did." He trailed off, but I understood. Even if he wanted to help me, going against Lysander's warning would risk his own career. That night, I called my parents for the first time since being fired. I'd been putting off that conversation, hoping I'd have good news to share, hoping I could present my termination as a minor setback rather than a career-ending catastrophe. "Sweetheart, you sound terrible," my mother said the moment she heard my voice. "What's wrong?" I broke down. 3 weeks of rejection, of watching my professional reputation get systematically destroyed, of realizing that everything I'd worked for could be erased by one vindictive man, it all came pouring out. I told them about Lysander, about the blacklisting, about the safety concerns that had started this whole nightmare. "This is exactly like what happened to your Uncle David," my father said grimly. "Remember when he tried to report that contamination issue at the medical device plant?" I did remember. Uncle David had worked as a quality control inspector for 15 years before he discovered that his company was shipping potentially contaminated surgical instruments. When he reported it to regulatory authorities, the company fired him for performance issues and made sure he never worked in medical device manufacturing again. He'd ended up driving a taxi until he retired. "The system protects itself, honey," my mother said gently. "Sometimes doing the right thing costs more than we expect." "So what am I supposed to do?" I asked, my voice cracking. "Just give up? Let Lysander win?" "You don't give up," my father said firmly. "But you might need to be smarter about how you fight back." The 3rd week was when I hit absolute rock bottom. My savings account, never substantial on a researcher's salary, was dwindling rapidly. I started applying for positions outside my field, lab technician roles, research assistant positions, even administrative jobs at biotechnology companies. Same result, initial interest followed by sudden rejection. I spent entire days on my couch, alternating between rage and despair. I'd worked so hard to build my career, to earn my credentials, to make a difference in pharmaceutical safety. Now I was facing the possibility that I might never work in my field again, all because I'd tried to protect patients from a potentially dangerous medication error. The worst part was the isolation. Most of my friends were colleagues in the pharmaceutical industry, and as word of my problematic reputation spread, they stopped returning my calls. I understood their self-preservation instinct, but it hurt nonetheless. I'd become a pariah, someone whose very association could damage their own careers. It was during this dark period that I started really listening to that whistleblower recording I'd obtained from Blackstone's compliance department. I'd requested it mostly out of curiosity. I wanted to hear how my own voice sounded, whether I'd come across as professional and reasonable when I'd made my safety concerns. What I heard instead changed everything, because buried in that 23-minute recording, captured while I'd been on hold waiting for the compliance officer, was a conversation between Lysander and his assistant Brianna Croft that revealed something far more sinister than simple retaliation against a whistleblower. They weren't just planning to fire me. They were planning to cover up a pattern of safety violations that went back years, violations that could affect thousands of patients if the Morrison trial proceeded as scheduled, and suddenly, my personal career problems seemed very small compared to the scope of what I'd accidentally uncovered. That recording didn't just contain evidence of my wrongful termination. It contained evidence of a systematic cover-up that could destroy Blackstone Pharmaceuticals entirely, if I was brave enough to use it. For the first time in 3 weeks, I felt something other than despair. I felt determined. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop, a legal pad, and the whistleblower recording file open on my computer screen. For 3 weeks, I'd been operating under the assumption that I was just another casualty of corporate politics, a principled employee who'd been sacrificed for speaking up. But as I listened to that recording for the 4th time, transcribing every word with meticulous precision, I began to understand that I wasn't just a victim of Lysander's retaliation. I was a witness to something much bigger. The conversation I'd accidentally captured took place while I was on hold, waiting for the compliance officer to pick up my call about the Morrison trial dosage concerns. What I'd initially dismissed as background office chatter was actually a damning discussion between Lysander and his assistant Brianna Croft about how to handle what they called the safety problem. "We can't have another Ragnar Reed situation." Lysander's voice was clear on the recording, even though he'd obviously thought he was speaking privately. "This Vance woman is asking the same questions about kidney function calculations that got Reed transferred. What do you want me to do?" Brianna's voice was quieter, but still audible. "Same thing we did with Reed, with Morrison, with the others. Document some performance issues, create a paper trail, and get rid of the troublemaker before she connects the dots." "But sir, what if she's right about the dosage calculations? What if there really is a safety issue?" There was a long pause before Lysander responded, and when he did, his voice carried a coldness that made my blood freeze. "Brianna, listen to me very carefully. The Morrison trial represents a potential $2 billion market opportunity. We are 6 months behind schedule and $18 million over budget. The FDA will approve this drug based on our Phase 3 data, and we will worry about fine-tuning dosages during post-market surveillance. Do you understand what I'm saying?" Yes, sir." "Good. Now, I need you to start building a file on Dr. Vance. Missed deadlines, questionable research methods, disruptive behavior, whatever it takes. And reach out to our contacts at the other research facilities. Make sure they understand that hiring someone like her would be problematic. As I listened to those words again, something fundamental shifted inside me. This wasn't about me being too sensitive or failing to navigate office politics. This wasn't even about one vindictive director protecting his ego. This was about a systematic cover-up of safety violations that could affect millions of patients, orchestrated by someone who saw human lives as acceptable collateral damage for corporate profits. The mention of Dr. Ragnar Reed was particularly chilling. I remembered him as a thorough, conscientious researcher who'd been mysteriously transferred to a consulting role just before I'd started noticing problems with the Morrison trial protocols. If Lysander had gotten rid of him for asking the same questions I was asking, then there was a pattern here, a deliberate strategy of silencing anyone who threatened to expose safety issues. But more than that, I realized something that changed everything. I had power. For 3 weeks, I'd been thinking like a victim, focusing on what had been done to me, what I'd lost, how unfairly I'd been treated. But sitting there in my kitchen at 2 a.m., transcribing evidence of corporate conspiracy and patient endangerment, I understood that I wasn't powerless at all. I was dangerous. Lysander had made a critical error. In his arrogance, in his certainty that he could destroy my career and silence me permanently, he'd gotten careless. He'd conducted incriminating conversations within range of a recording device that I now legally possessed. He'd revealed not just his plans to retaliate against me, but his involvement in a much larger pattern of safety violations and cover-ups. The question was, what was I going to do about it? My first instinct was to take the recording directly to the FDA, to blow the whistle on Blackstone's entire operation and let federal regulators sort it out. But as I thought through that scenario, I realized it would probably end the same way. My internal whistleblower complaint had ended, with Lysander's word against mine, with my credibility already destroyed by his blacklisting campaign, with months or years of investigation while the Morrison trial proceeded and potentially harmful drugs reached the market. Going through official channels hadn't worked before, and it wouldn't work now. Lysander had too much influence, too many allies, too much institutional protection. If I was going to take him down, I needed to be smarter than that. I needed to be strategic. I spent the rest of that night creating what I came to think of as my war plan. I mapped out everything I knew about Blackstone's research operations, every safety concern I'd documented over 3 years, every instance where Lysander had dismissed legitimate concerns or fast-tracked dangerous protocols. I identified potential allies, researchers who'd been pushed out like Dr. Reed, current employees who might be willing to speak up if they felt protected, regulatory contacts who might be interested in evidence of systematic violations. Most importantly, I started thinking about leverage. The recording was damning, but it was just one piece of evidence. If I was going to bring down someone as powerful as Lysander Hayes, I needed more than one smoking gun. I needed an arsenal. As dawn broke over my apartment, I made 3 critical decisions that would define everything that followed. First, I would not be going back to my old life. The career-focused, rule-following, system-trusting woman who'd worked at Blackstone was gone forever. She'd been naive enough to believe that doing the right thing would be rewarded, that institutional processes would protect her, that people like Lysander could be defeated through proper channels. That woman had been destroyed in Lysander's office 3 weeks ago. Second, I would not be content with simply clearing my own name or getting my job back. This wasn't about personal vindication anymore. This was about patient safety, about the integrity of pharmaceutical research, about making sure that Lysander Hayes could never again silence someone who tried to protect people from dangerous drugs. Third, I would not be fighting fair. Lysander had already proven that he didn't operate by the rules of professional ethics or basic human decency. He'd used his power to destroy careers, suppress safety concerns, and potentially endanger thousands of patients. If I was going to beat him, I needed to be willing to use every weapon at my disposal, including some he would never see coming. I opened a new document on my laptop and began typing. Phase 1, Intelligence Gathering Objective, Document Full. Scope of safety violations and identify all participants in cover-up timeline. 30 days priority targets, Dr. Ragnar Reed, other terminated researchers, current Blackstone employees with concerns. For the first time since walking out of Blackstone Pharmaceuticals with my belongings in a cardboard box, I felt like myself again. Not the compliant, optimistic version of myself who'd trusted the system to protect her, but a new version. Harder, smarter, and absolutely determined to make sure Lysander Hayes faced consequences for what he'd done. I was no longer Eira Vance, the wrongfully terminated researcher. I was Eira Vance, The woman who was going to bring down Blackstone Pharmaceuticals' golden boy and expose a conspiracy that reached far beyond one vindictive director. The war was about to begin, and this time, I intended to win, but first, I needed to find Dr. Ragnar Reed and discover exactly what he knew about Lysander's pattern of silencing inconvenient voices. If I was right about the scope of this cover-up, Reed wouldn't be the only former employee with a story to tell, and if I was really lucky, some of them might be as angry as I was. Finding Dr. Ragnar Reed turned out to be easier than I'd expected. Though what I discovered about his situation was far more disturbing than I'd imagined. Reed had been one of Blackstone's most respected safety compliance officers for 8 years before his sudden, consulting transition, 6 months before my termination. A quick LinkedIn search showed that he'd left pharmaceutical research entirely and was now working as a high school chemistry teacher in Oakwood Valley, a small town about 3 hours north of the city. That alone told me everything I needed to know about how thoroughly Lysander had destroyed his career. I drove to Oakwood Valley on a Saturday morning, telling myself I was just going to observe, maybe strike up a casual conversation. What I found was a man who looked like he'd aged 5 years in the 6 months since leaving Blackstone. Reed was setting up equipment in his classroom when I knocked on the open door. He looked up, and I watched recognition dawn in his eyes, followed immediately by something that looked like fear. "Dr. Vance," he said carefully. "What brings you to Oakwood Valley?" "I was hoping we could talk," I said. "About Blackstone. About Lysander Hayes." Reed glanced around his empty classroom as if checking for surveillance devices. "I can't discuss my former employment. I signed a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement." "So did I said. "But I have something you need to hear." I played him the recording. As Lysander's voice filled the small chemistry classroom, describing how they'd handled the Ragnar Reed situation. I watched Reed's face cycle through shock, anger, and finally, a grim sort of vindication. "Son of a bitch," he whispered when the recording ended. "I knew it. I knew he'd orchestrated everything, but I could never prove it." "What happened to you?" I asked. Reed sat heavily in one of the student desks, suddenly looking much older than his 53 years. "Same thing that happened to you, just slower and more subtle." I started raising concerns about safety protocols being rushed, about data analysis being optimized to support predetermined conclusions. Lysander began documenting every minor mistake I made, every time I was 5 minutes late, every email that could be interpreted as having an unprofessional tone. The non-disclosure agreement? Part of my severance package. I couldn't afford to fight it legally, and Lysander made it clear that if I caused any trouble, he'd make sure I never worked in pharmaceutical research again. Reed laughed bitterly. Turns out he did that anyway. But Reed's story was just the beginning. Over the next 2 weeks, I systematically tracked down every researcher who'd left Blackstone during Lysander's tenure as research director. What I discovered was a pattern so blatant that I couldn't believe it had gone unnoticed by corporate oversight. Dr. Zephyr Sterling had been forced out after questioning data manipulation in the cardiovascular safety trials. She was now working at a small biotech startup for half her former salary. Caspian Wild, a former clinical trial coordinator, had been terminated for performance issues after raising concerns about patient recruitment protocols that prioritized speed over proper screening. He'd left pharmaceutical research entirely and was working in medical device sales. Gwenville Beckett, a statistician, had been pushed out after refusing to exclude outlier data points that showed increased adverse reactions in elderly patients. She was now freelance consulting and struggling to find steady work. Each of them had signed NDAs. Each of them had been professionally isolated and blacklisted. And each of them, when I played them the recording, expressed the same combination of vindication and fury that I'd seen in Reed's face. "We should form a support group," Zephyr said when I met with her at a coffee shop in the financial district. "Survivors of Lysander Hayes' management style. Or a class action lawsuit," Caspian suggested during our phone conversation, but it was Gwenville who pointed out the most crucial detail. "Eira, do you realize what this means for all the trials we worked on? If Lysander was systematically removing researchers who raised safety concerns, how many dangerous drugs might have been approved based on compromised data?" That question kept me awake for 3 straight nights. I began creating what I called my evidence matrix, a comprehensive spreadsheet documenting every safety concern that had been raised and subsequently ignored, every researcher who'd been pushed out for raising inconvenient questions, and every drug trial that had proceeded despite legitimate warnings. The pattern was horrifying. The Morrison Alzheimer's trial wasn't an isolated case of corner cutting. It was part of a systematic approach that prioritized speed and profitability over patient safety across Blackstone's entire research portfolio. Lysander hadn't just been retaliating against individual troublemakers, he'd been engineering a culture where safety concerns were treated as obstacles to overcome rather than issues to address. But building a case required more than just testimony from former employees. I needed current intelligence about what was happening inside Blackstone now, and that meant finding allies who were still on the inside. This part required more delicate maneuvering. Reaching out to current employees carried risks for both of us. They could lose their jobs for talking to me, and I could be accused of corporate espionage or interference with business operations. But I knew that some of my former colleagues had to be concerned about the direction the research department was taking under Lysander's leadership. I started with Dr. Hyacinth Sterling, a junior researcher who'd always struck me as having strong ethical principles. I reached out through a mutual contact from graduate school, suggesting a casual coffee meeting to catch up on industry news. Hyacinth was nervous when we met, constantly glancing around the coffee shop as if expecting Lysander to emerge from behind a newspaper like some corporate spy thriller villain. "I can't talk about specific projects," she said immediately. "You know that, right?" "I'm not asking about specific projects," I assured her. "I'm just concerned about the research environment. Has anything changed since I left?" The floodgates opened. "Eira, it's gotten so much worse," Hyacinth said, leaning forward and lowering her voice. "Lysander has implemented these new efficiency protocols that basically amount to rushing through safety checks. Anyone who raises concerns gets labeled as not being a team player. The whole department is walking on eggshells." "Are people still raising safety concerns?" "Privately, yes. But no one wants to put anything in writing anymore. Not after what happened to you, and especially not after what happened to Dr. Kalen Finch." My blood went cold. "What happened to Kalen?" "You didn't hear? He was terminated last month. Same story, performance issues, failure to meet deadlines. But everyone knows the real reason was that he questioned the statistical analysis on the neurological enhancement trials. Kalen Finch had been hired just 2 months before my termination. He was brilliant, meticulous, and had a reputation for catching errors that other researchers missed. If Lysander had already gotten rid of him, it meant the cover-up was accelerating." "Hyacinth, I need you to understand something," I said carefully. "What happened to me wasn't an isolated incident. There's a pattern here, and it's putting patients at risk. If you or anyone else in the department has concerns about current research protocols, there might be ways to address them that don't require going through internal channels." She stared at me for a long moment. "Are you talking about what I think you're talking about?" "I'm talking about making sure that safety concerns are heard by people who have the authority to act on them, even if that means going outside the company. That's career suicide, Eira. You know that better than anyone." "Maybe," I said. "But the alternative might be literal suicide for patients who trust us to get the science right." That conversation haunted me for days, but it also crystallized something important. The researchers still working at Blackstone weren't just afraid of Lysander, they were afraid of a system that punished integrity and rewarded compliance. They needed more than just encouragement to speak up. They needed protection, support, and evidence that speaking up could actually make a difference. They needed to see that Lysander Hayes wasn't untouchable after all. By the end of my second week of intelligence gathering, I had documented evidence of at least 12 researchers who'd been pushed out for raising safety concerns, detailed testimony about ongoing protocol violations, and a growing network of former employees who were willing to speak out if they felt protected from retaliation. But I still needed the one piece of evidence that would make everything else credible. Proof that Lysander's cover-ups had actually resulted in dangerous drugs reaching the market, and I had a feeling I knew exactly where to find it. The answer came to me while I was reviewing FDA adverse event reports at 3 a.m. on a Tuesday night, cross-referencing drug approvals with the timeline of researcher terminations at Blackstone. I'd been methodically checking every drug that had been approved after a safety-conscious researcher had been pushed out, looking for patterns in post-market complications. That's when I found the Cardiotec scandal. Cardiotec was a blood pressure medication that Blackstone had rushed to market 18 months ago, shortly after Dr. Zephyr Sterling had been forced out for raising concerns about cardiovascular safety trials. The drug had been hailed as a breakthrough treatment for elderly patients with resistant hypertension, generating over $800 million in revenue in its first year. It had also been quietly recalled 6 months ago after reports of severe kidney damage in patients over 65. I stared at my laptop screen, reading the FDA recall notice for the third time. The language was carefully neutral, clinical in its description of adverse renal events in elderly populations, and recommended discontinuation pending further safety evaluation. But buried in the technical details was exactly what I'd been looking for: proof that Lysander's cover-ups had consequences beyond corporate politics. According to the FDA database, 847 patients had experienced serious kidney complications from Cardiotec. 12 had required emergency dialysis. 3 had died. I pulled up my evidence matrix and cross-referenced the dates. Dr. Sterling had been terminated in March, 2 years ago. Cardiotech's Phase 3 trials had been completed that August, with FDA approval granted in December. The drug had hit the market in January, and the first kidney damage reports had started trickling in by June, but here was the smoking gun. In my pile of documents from former Blackstone employees, I had Dr. Sterling's original safety concerns about the cardiovascular trials. She'd identified the exact same kidney function issues in elderly patients that had led to the recall, but her warnings had been dated 8 months before the FDA approval point, 8 months when those deaths could have been prevented if anyone had. Listen to her. My hands were shaking as I called Dr. Sterling. It was nearly 4 a.m., but this couldn't wait. Eira? Her voice was groggy but alert. What's wrong? Zephyr, I need to ask you about the cardiovascular safety trials you were working on before you left Blackstone. Specifically about Cardiotech. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Why are you asking about Cardiotech? She said finally, her voice tight. Because it was recalled 6 months ago for exactly the kidney problems you identified in your safety reports. The problems that Lysander ignored when he forced you out. Jesus Christ. I heard her moving around, probably getting out of bed. How many patients? 847 serious complications. 12 on dialysis. 3 dead. The silence stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. Zephyr? I'm here. Her voice was hollow. I knew this would happen. I told them it would happen. I documented everything, showed them the kidney function data, explained exactly why the dosage calculations were dangerous for elderly patients. And they destroyed my career for it. I need those documents, I said. Your original safety reports, the data analysis, everything you tried to show them. I kept copies, she said quietly. I kept everything, even though I probably wasn't supposed to. I guess some part of me knew this day would come. We met the next morning in a small diner outside the city, away from any chance of running into Blackstone employees. Zephyr looked like she hadn't slept, and the manila folder she slid across the table was thick with documents. This is everything, she said. My original safety analysis, the kidney function calculations that showed dangerous accumulation in elderly patients, the emails where I tried to raise concerns, and Lysander's responses dismissing them. I opened the folder and immediately understood why Lysander had been so desperate to get rid of her. Dr. Sterling's analysis was thorough, professional, and absolutely damning. She'd identified not just the specific mechanism by which Cardiotech could cause kidney damage, but had calculated the exact patient populations most at risk and recommended dosage modifications that could have prevented the complications entirely. Lysander's email responses were brief and dismissive, noted, "We'll review with team, please focus on meeting trial deadlines." But there was one email that made my blood freeze. Dr. Sterling, Lysander had written, I appreciate your diligence, but I need to remind you that safety modifications at this stage would delay FDA approval by at least 6 months and cost the company an estimated $200 million in lost revenue. Please confine your analysis to the parameters we've already established with regulatory authorities. $200 million. That was the price Lysander had put on preventing kidney damage and deaths in elderly patients, but the Cardiotech documents were just the beginning. Over the next week, I dove deep into FDA adverse event databases, drug recall notices, and post-market safety warnings, cross-referencing everything with my timeline of researcher terminations at Blackstone. The pattern was horrifying. Neuroplexin, an antidepressant rushed to market after Dr. Kalen Finch had been terminated for questioning statistical analysis, had been hit with a black box warning for increased suicide risk in young adults, exactly what Finch had predicted in his safety reports. Osteomax, a bone density medication approved after Caspian Wild was forced out for questioning patient recruitment protocols, was now facing lawsuits for causing jaw necrosis in patients who hadn't been properly screened for dental problems. Romitin, an arthritis drug that Gwenville Beckett had raised statistical concerns about, was currently under FDA investigation for liver toxicity that her excluded outlier data had clearly indicated. Each drug represented hundreds of millions in revenue for Blackstone. Each drug had also caused documented harm to patients that could have been prevented if the terminated researchers' safety concerns had been addressed. I was looking at a systematic pattern of putting profits before patient safety that went far beyond individual misconduct. This was corporate negligence on a scale that could bring down the entire company, but the discovery that changed everything came when I found the smoking gun that tied it all directly to Lysander personally. In Zephyr's files was a document I'd initially overlooked, an internal Blackstone memo about managing regulatory challenges and optimizing approval timelines. The memo was marked confidential and was addressed to senior management, but Zephyr had been copied because of her role in cardiovascular safety assessments. The memo was signed by Lysander Hayes and dated 6 months before my termination. In cold, clinical language, Lysander outlined a strategy for streamlining safety review processes that essentially amounted to removing or reassigning any researcher who consistently raised concerns that could delay drug approvals. The memo identified specific researchers as high risk for project delays and recommended performance management interventions to either modify their behavior or facilitate their departure. My name was on the list. So were Dr. Reed's, Dr. Sterling's, and 8 others, but the most damaging part of the memo was Lysander's cost-benefit analysis. He'd calculated that each month of delay in drug approval cost Blackstone an average of $50 million in lost revenue. He then compared this to the negligible long-term costs of post-market safety issues, noting that recalls and lawsuits typically cost less than pre-market delays and could be managed through standard legal and insurance frameworks. In other words, Lysander had determined that it was more profitable to let dangerous drugs reach the market and deal with the consequences later than to address safety concerns during development. He'd literally put a price tag on human lives and decided they were worth less than corporate profits. I sat in my apartment reading that memo for the 4th time, and I realized that everything had changed. This wasn't just about my wrongful termination anymore. This wasn't even just about Lysander's pattern of retaliating against safety-conscious researchers. This was about a deliberate strategy of corporate manslaughter that had already killed at least 3 people and harmed hundreds more, and I had the evidence to prove it. For the first time since I'd been fired, I wasn't thinking about getting my job back or clearing my reputation. I was thinking about justice for every patient who'd been harmed by drugs that should never have reached the market, and accountability for the man who decided their lives were an acceptable business expense. Lysander Hayes wasn't just going to lose his job when this came out. He was going to prison, but first, I had to make sure he couldn't escape justice the way he'd escaped accountability for so long. Lysander Hayes had spent years building a network of influence, cultivating relationships with regulators, and positioning himself as untouchable within the pharmaceutical industry. If I was going to bring him down, I couldn't afford to make the same mistake I'd made with my original whistleblower complaint, approaching this as if the system would work fairly. The system was broken. Lysander had helped break it. So I needed to build a new system around him, one he couldn't control or manipulate his way out of. I spent 3 days creating what I called my comprehensive exposure strategy, mapping out every avenue through which Lysander's crimes could be exposed and every ally I would need to make it happen. This couldn't be a simple whistleblower complaint or a single news story that he could spin or suppress. This had to be a coordinated, multi-front assault that would hit him simultaneously from directions he couldn't anticipate or defend against. First, I needed legal firepower. The evidence I'd gathered was criminal in nature: corporate conspiracy, negligent homicide, fraud. But I couldn't just walk into the FBI field office with a box of documents and expect them to take me seriously. I needed a lawyer with experience in pharmaceutical litigation, someone who understood both the technical aspects of drug safety and the legal framework for prosecuting corporate crimes. Through Dr. Sterling's connections, I was introduced to Sarah Martinez-Chen, a former FDA attorney who'd left the agency to specialize in pharmaceutical whistleblower cases. When I called her office, I was honest about my situation. I was a terminated researcher with evidence of criminal misconduct, but I couldn't afford her standard fees. "Dr. Vance," she said after I'd explained the basics, "if you have evidence of systematic cover-ups that led to patient deaths, money is not going to be the limiting factor here. Can you come in tomorrow?" The meeting with Martinez-Chen changed everything. She reviewed my evidence with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent 15 years prosecuting pharmaceutical companies, and her assessment was unequivocal. "This is a federal case," she said, spreading Lysander's internal memo across her conference table. "Conspiracy to defraud the FDA, willful endangerment of patients, possible RICO violations if we can prove this pattern extends beyond Blackstone. We're talking about potential prison sentences in the decades, not years." "But can we prove it?" I asked. "Lysander has connections throughout the industry. He's positioned himself as credible and successful. I'm just a disgruntled former employee with an axe to grind." Martinez-Chen smiled grimly. "Dr. Vance, disgruntled former employees with evidence are exactly how we bring down corporate criminals. But you're right that we need to be strategic about this. We need to build an overwhelming case before we make any moves, because once we surface, Lysander and Blackstone will throw everything they have at discrediting us." We developed a 3-phase plan. Phase 1 involved building an unshakable coalition of witnesses. I would systematically contact every researcher who'd been pushed out by Lysander, every current employee with safety concerns, and every patient or family member who'd been harmed by the recalled drugs. Martinez-Chen would work on securing legal protections for witnesses and building relationships with federal prosecutors who specialized in pharmaceutical crimes. Phase 2 focused on media strategy. We couldn't rely solely on legal proceedings, which could take years and might be influenced by Blackstone's lobbying power. We needed public pressure, and that meant coordinating with investigative journalists who could tell this story in a way that would generate outrage and attention. Phase 3 was the coordinated exposure, simultaneous filing of federal complaints, release of evidence to multiple media outlets, and notification to regulatory authorities and congressional oversight committees. The goal was to create such a firestorm that Lysander couldn't suppress or spin the story, but the most crucial element of the plan was timing. We needed to move before Lysander suspected what was coming, but we also needed to wait until we had enough evidence to guarantee success. Martinez-Chen estimated we would need at least 6 weeks to build an airtight case. 6 weeks during which more patients might be harmed by drugs that should have been recalled, more safety-conscious researchers might be forced out, and more evidence might be destroyed. It was Dr. Hyacinth Sterling who gave me the intelligence that made the timing decision for us. "Eira, I need to tell you something," she said when she called me 2 days after my meeting with Martinez-Chen. "Lysander just announced a major presentation to the board of directors scheduled for next month. He's calling it Research Division. Success Metrics and Strategic Vision for Accelerated Growth." What does that mean? It means he's positioning himself for promotion to Senior Vice President of Research and Development. If he gets that position, he'll have oversight of research operations across all of Blackstone's divisions, not just our department. My blood went cold. How many more researchers would be under his authority? All of them. Every drug safety officer, every clinical trial coordinator, every statistician who might raise inconvenient questions about data analysis. Eira, if Lysander gets promoted, he'll be able to institutionalize his cover-up methods across the entire company. That changed everything. We couldn't wait 6 weeks to build a perfect case. We had to move before that board presentation, which meant we had exactly 3 weeks to execute our plan. I called an emergency meeting with Martinez-Chen, Dr. Sterling, Dr. Reed, and the other terminated researchers. We met in the conference room of Martinez-Chen's law firm on a Saturday morning, and I laid out the accelerated timeline. 3 weeks isn't enough time to build the kind of comprehensive case we'd planned, Martinez-Chen said bluntly. We'll have to prioritize the strongest evidence and accept that some elements of the investigation will be incomplete. What are our priorities? Dr. Reed asked. I had already thought about this. First priority, the criminal evidence. The internal memo, the drug recall connections, the documented pattern of patient harm. That's what will put Lysander in prison and prevent him from ever doing this again. Second priority, Dr. Sterling added, protecting current employees who are willing to testify. If this goes public and they're not legally protected, Lysander will destroy their careers before the investigation is complete. Third priority, said Gwenville Beckett, making sure the media understands the scope of this. This isn't just about one bad manager or one company cutting corners. This is about an entire system that rewards profits over patient safety. We spent the next 8 hours developing detailed assignments for each team member. Dr. Reed would coordinate with other terminated researchers to gather their evidence and prepare their testimony. Dr. Sterling would work with Martinez-Chen to secure whistleblower protections for current employees. Gwenville would help me analyze the statistical patterns in the drug safety data to build the strongest possible case for systematic misconduct. I would handle the most dangerous part, gathering evidence that was still inside Blackstone. Eira, you understand the risks here, Martinez-Chen said as we were wrapping up. If Lysander discovers what you're doing before we're ready to go public, he'll have 3 weeks to destroy evidence, silence witnesses, and build a defense strategy. You could end up facing criminal charges yourself for corporate espionage or harassment. I understand, I said. But if we don't get the internal evidence we need, Lysander walks away from this with a slap on the wrist and a golden parachute. More people die, and nothing changes. There's another option, Dr. Sterling said quietly. We could go public now with what we have. It might not be enough to put Lysander in prison, but it would probably prevent his promotion and force Blackstone to make some changes. I thought about the 3 patients who died from cardiotech complications. I thought about the hundreds more who'd been harmed by drugs that should never have reached the market. I thought about Dr. Kalen Finch and all the other researchers who'd been destroyed for trying to protect patients. No, I said firmly. We don't settle for half measures. We end this completely, or we don't do it at all. 3 weeks to gather evidence, build alliances, and execute the most important exposé in pharmaceutical industry history. 3 weeks to make sure Lysander Hayes faced justice for every patient he'd harmed and every researcher he'd silenced. 3 weeks to transform myself from a wrongfully terminated whistleblower into the person who brought down one of the most corrupt executives in corporate America. The clock was ticking, and everything depended on what happened next. The morning of Lysander's board presentation, I was sitting in my rental car across from Blackstone Pharmaceuticals at 6:30 a.m., watching the building come to life. Security guards, early arriving executives, maintenance staff, all following their predictable routines while completely unaware that today would mark the end of Lysander Hayes' career and the beginning of the biggest pharmaceutical scandal in decades. Getting the final pieces of evidence from inside Blackstone had required 2 weeks of careful coordination and one significant stroke of luck. The coordination came from Dr. Hyacinth Sterling, who had gradually gained access to Lysander's files by volunteering to help prepare materials for his board presentation. The luck came when Lysander decided to use my own Morrison trial research as a centerpiece of his success story, requiring Hyacinth to access archived files that contained my original safety analyses. "Eira, you're not going to believe what I found," Hyacinth had said during our clandestine meeting 3 days earlier. "Lysander kept everything. Not just your reports, but his responses, his instructions to other department heads about handling safety obstructionists, even email chains about how to document performance issues for researchers who raised inconvenient questions." The files Hyacinth had copied were the final piece of our puzzle, direct evidence that Lysander's pattern of silencing safety-conscious researchers was not just personal retaliation, but a deliberate corporate strategy that he'd systematically implemented across multiple departments. But more than that, the files contained something we hadn't expected: evidence that Lysander had been in direct contact with FDA reviewers during the approval process for several drugs, providing them with sanitized safety data that excluded the concerns raised by terminated researchers. That wasn't just corporate misconduct. That was federal fraud. Now, as I watched Blackstone's executives arrive for what they thought would be a routine board presentation about research efficiency, I knew that everything was about to change. At exactly 9 a.m., as Lysander was undoubtedly putting the finishing touches on his presentation in the building above me, Martinez-Chan was walking into the FBI field office downtown with a comprehensive criminal complaint backed by over 200 pages of evidence. At 9:15, investigative journalist David Cross from the National Health Reporter would receive an encrypted file containing the full scope of our findings. Time to break the story online exactly as Lysander began his presentation. At 9:30, copies of all evidence would be simultaneously delivered to the FDA's Office of Criminal Investigations, the Department of Justice, and the Congressional Subcommittee overseeing pharmaceutical regulation. But the piece de resistance was happening in real time, orchestrated by Dr. Sterling and executed through the same board presentation technology that Lysander was planning to use to secure his promotion. I had suggested it during our final planning meeting, remembering how devastatingly effective a similar tactic had been in the original story that inspired my approach. "What if we don't just wait for Lysander to finish his presentation before we expose him?" I'd said. "What if we expose him during the presentation itself?" The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Hyacinth had legitimate access to the presentation system as Lysander's research assistant. During his presentation, at the moment when he would be showcasing the research efficiency improvements that had driven Blackstone's recent successes, she would remotely access the presentation and insert additional slides containing Lysander's own internal memos about targeting safety-conscious researchers, slides showing the direct correlation between researcher terminations and subsequent drug recalls, slides displaying his cost-benefit analysis comparing human lives to corporate profits, all of it projected on the screen behind him as he spoke to Blackstone's board of directors, their eyes widening in horror as they realized what they were seeing. My phone buzzed at 10:47 a.m. with a text from Hyacinth. "It's done. He's finished." But I didn't need the text to know that our plan had worked. Through the glass windows of Blackstone's executive conference room on the 15th floor, I could see people standing, pointing, and what looked like Lysander gesticulating frantically at the screen behind him. My phone rang. "Martinez-Chan. Eira, the FBI just called. They're executing search warrants at Blackstone in 30 minutes. They want you to come in this afternoon to provide additional testimony, but they've already confirmed that they have enough evidence to file federal charges." "What kind of charges?" "Conspiracy to defraud federal agencies, willful endangerment of patients, obstruction of justice, and about 6 other felonies. Lysander Hayes is going to be arrested before the day is over." As I watched through my binoculars, I could see security guards entering the conference room. Lysander was standing with his hands raised, shouting something at the board members who were now backing away from him as if he were contaminated. At 11:23 a.m., David Cross's article went live with the headline, "Pharmaceutical Executives Systematically Silenced Safety Researchers, Leading to Drug Recalls and Patient Deaths." Within an hour, the story had been picked up by every major news outlet in the country. At 11:45 a.m., Lysander Hayes was escorted out of Blackstone Pharmaceuticals in handcuffs, past a growing crowd of reporters who'd arrived after the story broke online. At 12:15 p.m., Blackstone's stock price had dropped 34%, wiping out over $2 billion in market value. At 1:30 p.m., the FDA announced emergency reviews of every drug approval that had occurred during Lysander's tenure as research director, but the moment that made everything worthwhile came at 2:15 p.m., when my phone rang with a call from Dr. Kalen Finch. "Eira," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I just saw the news. I can't believe you actually did it. You brought him down." "We brought him down," I corrected. "All of us. Every researcher he silenced, every safety concern he dismissed, every patient who was harmed, we all brought him down together." "What happens now?" I looked up at the Blackstone building, where FBI agents were carrying boxes of evidence out the front entrance while news crews filmed everything. Through the windows, I could see employees gathering in clusters, probably trying to figure out what this meant for their own careers and projects. "Now we make sure this never happens again," I said. "Now we build a system where patient safety actually comes first, where researchers who speak up are protected instead of destroyed, where companies can't sacrifice lives for profits." "And Lysander?" I thought about the 3 patients who died from cardiotech complications, about Dr. Reed teaching high school chemistry instead of saving lives through pharmaceutical research, about all the researchers who'd been too intimidated to speak up about safety concerns. Lysander faces justice. Real justice, not corporate justice. He's going to prison for a very long time. As I drove away from Blackstone that afternoon, I reflected on how much had changed since that morning 4 months ago when I'd been fired for insubordination. The quiet, compliant researcher who'd believed the system would protect her was gone forever. In her place was someone harder, smarter, and absolutely committed to making sure that speaking up for patient safety was never again punished with career destruction. But the best part wasn't Lysander's downfall or the vindication of my safety concerns. The best part was knowing that every researcher currently working in pharmaceutical development had just seen what happened when someone tried to silence safety concerns. They'd seen that corporate retaliation wasn't inevitable, that corrupt executives weren't untouchable, and that sometimes the quiet person documenting everything in the corner turned out to be the most dangerous person in the room. The pharmaceutical industry had just learned a very important lesson about the power of meticulous documentation and strategic patience, and I was just getting started. The next 72 hours felt like watching a controlled demolition in slow motion, every carefully placed charge detonating exactly when and where it was supposed to, bringing down not just Lysander Hayes but the entire corrupt structure he'd built around himself. By Wednesday morning, the pharmaceutical industry was in complete chaos. Lysander's arrest had been just the beginning. The FBI's search warrants at Blackstone had uncovered evidence that went far beyond what we'd originally suspected, revealing a network of corruption that extended into other pharmaceutical companies, regulatory agencies, and research institutions. Across the country. I was sitting in Martinez's office, watching the news coverage on her wall-mounted TV, when the full scope of what we'd unleashed became clear. "This is unprecedented," the CNN anchor was saying, shuffling through papers as if trying to process the magnitude of the story. "Federal prosecutors are calling it the largest pharmaceutical fraud case in U.S. history. At least 12 companies are now under investigation, with evidence suggesting systematic suppression of safety data across multiple drug categories." The screen cut to footage of FBI agents executing search warrants at Meridian Pharmaceuticals, Northpoint Biologics, and 3 other companies where terminated Blackstone researchers had found new employment, companies that had apparently been warned by Lysander about hiring problematic safety researchers. "Dr. Vance," Martinez said, muting the television, "you need to understand what you've accomplished here. This isn't just about Lysander anymore. You've exposed an entire system of corruption that's been operating for years." I was still processing that reality when my phone rang. The caller ID showed Dr. Ragnar Reed. "Eira," his voice was barely controlled, "I just got a call from the FBI. They want to interview me about my termination from Blackstone, but more than that, they want to know about the other companies that blacklisted me after I left. Apparently, the investigation has expanded to include industry-wide conspiracy to suppress safety research." "How do you feel about that?" I asked. There was a long pause. "Vindicated," he said finally. "For 8 months, I've been teaching high school chemistry and questioning whether I was crazy, whether I'd imagined the patterns I thought I saw. Now the FBI is treating those patterns as evidence of criminal conspiracy. What will you tell them? Everything, Reed said firmly. Every conversation, every veiled threat, every instance where I was told to prioritize timelines over patient safety. If this investigation can prevent other researchers from going through what we went through, I'll testify to everything I know. That conversation was repeated dozens of times over the next week. Dr. Sterling called to tell me that investigators had contacted her about testifying before a grand jury. Caspian Wild reached out to say that attorneys representing patients harmed by Osteomax wanted to interview him about the safety concerns he'd raised before being forced out. Gwenville Beckett reported that the FDA had asked her to consult on reviewing statistical methods used in drug approvals over the past 5 years, but the call that meant the most to me came from Dr. Hyacinth Sterling. Eira, I need to thank you, she said, her voice shaky with emotion. Yesterday, Blackstone's interim management called an all-hands meeting. They announced that they're implementing new whistleblower protections, independent safety review boards, and transparent reporting of all safety concerns. More than that, they're reinstating 3 researchers who were terminated for performance issues in the past year. How is the staff reacting? There's a lot of fear about job security and what the investigation will mean for ongoing projects, Hyacinth said. But there's also something I've never seen before: people are actually talking openly about safety concerns. Yesterday, Dr. Torvin Beckett stood up in a department meeting and questioned a protocol that he'd been afraid to challenge for months. 6 months ago, that would have been career suicide. Today, the department head thanked him for raising important questions. That was when I truly understood what we'd accomplished. We hadn't just brought down one corrupt executive, we'd changed the entire culture of pharmaceutical research. Safety concerns that had been whispered in hallways were now being discussed. In board meetings, researchers who'd been intimidated into silence were finding their voices again. The personal vindication came in forms I hadn't expected. On Thursday, I received a formal letter from Blackstone's new interim CEO, formally apologizing for my wrongful termination and offering me a position as Senior Director of Research Safety and Ethics, a new role they were creating specifically to prevent future incidents like Lysander's systematic suppression of safety concerns. The salary offer was 40% higher than what I'd been making before my termination. I declined, not because I was bitter, but because I'd realized something important about myself during those 4 months of unemployment and investigation. I didn't want to go back to being a cog in someone else's machine, even a reformed machine. I wanted to build something new. The media attention was overwhelming but gratifying. Within a week of Lysander's arrest, I'd been contacted by reporters from the Wall Street Journal, 60 Minutes, and 3 major pharmaceutical trade publications. They all wanted to hear the story of how a quiet researcher had brought down one of the industry's most powerful executives. Dr. Vance, the 60 Minutes correspondent, asked during our interview, "What would you say to other researchers who are currently facing pressure to suppress safety concerns?" "I'd tell them that documentation is power," I said, thinking about the evidence matrix that had started this entire investigation. Keep records of everything. Every safety concern dismissed, every pressure to meet timelines instead of addressing problems, every conversation where you're told that business considerations outweigh patient safety. You never know when that documentation might be the evidence that saves lives. Do you think Lysander Hayes represents an isolated case, or is this a broader problem in pharmaceutical research? The FBI's expanding investigation suggests this is a much broader problem, I said carefully, aware that ongoing legal proceedings limited what I could discuss publicly. But I think the real issue isn't individual bad actors, it's systems that reward profits over patients and punish people for speaking up about safety. Until we change those systems, there will always be more Lysander Hayes. The most satisfying moment came 2 weeks after Lysander's arrest, when I received an unexpected visitor at my apartment. Brianna Croft, Lysander's former assistant, was standing in my hallway looking nervous and embarrassed when I opened the door. "Dr. Vance, I know you have no reason to talk to me," she said immediately. "I know I was part of what happened to you. But I need you to know that I never understood the full scope of what Lysander was doing until I saw the news coverage." I invited her in, curious about what she wanted to say. "I kept thinking about our conversation that day you were fired," Brianna continued, sitting uncomfortably on my couch. "About how Lysander had told me to build a file on you, to document performance issues that would justify your termination. At the time, I thought it was just corporate politics. I didn't understand that there were life and death consequences to silencing researchers like you. What made you realize the truth?" "The cardiotech recall," she said quietly. "When that story broke about the patients who died, I remembered Dr. Sterling's safety reports that Lysander had told me to file away and forget about. I realized that if we'd listened to her, those people would still be alive. Brianna reached into her purse and pulled out a flash drive. This contains copies of everything I have access to. Every termination file Lysander had me build on researchers who raised safety concerns, every instruction he gave me about managing difficult employees, every conversation I overheard about prioritizing timelines over safety. I took the flash drive, understanding its significance. Why are you giving this to me instead of the FBI? Because they'll get it eventually anyway. I'm testifying before the grand jury next week, she said. But I wanted you to have it first. I wanted you to know that not everyone who worked for Lysander was aware of what he was really doing. Some of us were just following orders without understanding the consequences. What will you do now? I've been offered a position in Blackstone's new ethics compliance department, Brianna said. Helping to implement the reforms that are being put in place because of your investigation. It's redemptive work, I suppose. A chance to be part of the solution instead of part of the problem. After she left, I sat with that flash drive for a long time, thinking about how many people had been caught up in Lysander's web of corruption without fully understanding their role in it. Brianna wasn't a villain, she was another victim of a system that had normalized prioritizing business interests over human lives. The real measure of our victory wasn't just Lysander's downfall, but the transformation of everyone around him. 3 weeks after his arrest, Lysander Hayes was indicted on 14 federal charges including conspiracy to defraud federal agencies, willful endangerment of patients, obstruction of justice, and racketeering. Federal prosecutors announced they would be seeking a sentence of 25 to 30 years in prison. But more importantly, the pharmaceutical industry was beginning to change in ways that would outlast any individual prosecution. The FDA announced new requirements for independent safety reviews on all drug approvals. Congress passed emergency legislation strengthening whistleblower protections for researchers who report safety concerns. 3 major pharmaceutical companies proactively implemented ethics reforms to avoid being caught up in the expanding investigation, and in research facilities across the country, safety officers and clinical researchers were finding their voices again, speaking up about concerns they'd been afraid to raise for years. I was no longer Dr. Eira Vance, the wrongfully terminated researcher who'd been told she was too much trouble for asking inconvenient questions about patient safety. I was Dr. Eira Vance, the woman who'd brought down a corrupt system and inspired an entire industry to remember that their real job was protecting patients, not protecting profits. But the victory felt incomplete. Lysander was facing justice, the industry was reforming, and researchers were finding their voices again. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something much larger. The pharmaceutical industry had problems that went far beyond one corrupt executive, and there were probably dozens of other Lysander Hayes operating in research facilities around the world. If I'd learned anything from this experience, it was that systematic change required more than exposing individual bad actors. It required building something new, something that would ensure this never happened again, something that would put patient safety at the center of pharmaceutical research, not as an afterthought but as the driving principle that guided every decision. And I was starting to have ideas about what that something might look like. The idea crystallized during a phone call with Dr. Sterling 6 weeks after Lysander's indictment. She'd called to tell me about a disturbing pattern she'd noticed while consulting with the FDA on reviewing compromised drug approvals. Eira, it's not just Blackstone, she said, her voice tight with concern. I've been reviewing safety data from 12 different pharmaceutical companies, and I'm seeing the same patterns everywhere. Researchers terminated for raising concerns, safety data that's been optimized, statistical analyses that exclude inconvenient results. How widespread are we talking about? I think Lysander wasn't an outlier, I think he was the norm. The only difference is that he got caught. That conversation haunted me for days. If Sterling was right, then our victory against Lysander had only scratched the surface of a much deeper problem. We'd exposed one corrupt executive and reformed one company, but the underlying system that had enabled his corruption was still intact. That's when I realized that my story wasn't over. It was evolving. The opportunity came in the form of an unexpected phone call from Dr. Camden Wild, a former FDA official who'd been following the Blackstone case closely. She'd left the agency 2 years earlier to join a nonprofit focused on pharmaceutical policy reform, and she had a proposition. Dr. Vance, I've been watching what you accomplished with the Blackstone investigation, she said when we met for coffee. You've proven something that many of us have suspected for years, that the pharmaceutical industry has a systematic problem with suppressing safety research. But prosecution of individual cases won't solve the underlying issues. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting we build an organization dedicated to preventing these situations before they occur. An independent research safety institute that provides protection for researchers who identify safety concerns, conducts objective reviews of disputed safety data, and advocates for structural reforms that prioritize patient safety. The vision she outlined was ambitious, a non-profit organization that would serve as a buffer between pharmaceutical researchers and corporate pressure, funded by a combination of foundation grants, government contracts, and settlements from pharmaceutical fraud cases. Researchers facing retaliation for safety concerns could seek protection and support. Companies could request independent safety reviews to verify their internal findings. Regulatory agencies could access objective analysis of disputed safety data. Why me? I asked. Because you've proven that systematic change is possible, Camden said simply. You didn't just expose one corrupt executive, you inspired an entire industry to re-examine its priorities. That's the kind of leadership we need to build something permanent. Over the next month, I found myself at the center of conversations with former FDA officials, pharmaceutical industry reformers, patient advocacy groups, and academic researchers who all shared the same frustration with the current system. Everyone recognized the problems, but nobody had been able to build a sustainable solution. What we were proposing was revolutionary, an independent institution that could provide protection, resources, and advocacy for researchers who prioritized patient safety over corporate profits. We would be funded not by pharmaceutical companies, but by foundations and government grants that prioritized public health. Our board would include patient advocates, former regulators, and researchers with proven track records of putting safety first. Dr. Reed was the first to join our planning committee. Eira, I've been teaching high school chemistry for 8 months, but I've never stopped being a pharmaceutical safety researcher, he told me during our first organizational meeting. If there's a chance to build something that prevents other researchers from going through what we experienced, I want to be part of it. Dr. Sterling became our statistical analysis director. Gwenville Beckett agreed to lead our data integrity division. Even Caspian Wild left his medical device sales job to help develop our researcher protection protocols, but the partnership that surprised me most came from an unexpected source, Dr. Hyacinth Sterling reached out to join our efforts while still working at Blackstone. The company is committed to reform, she told me during a secure video call. But reform from within has limitations. Companies will always face pressure to prioritize profits, no matter how good their intentions. What you're building could provide the external accountability that internal reforms can't achieve. Wouldn't joining us create conflicts with your current position? Not if we're transparent about it, Hyacinth said. In fact, I think having researchers who are still working within the industry could help bridge the gap between external oversight and internal reform. We need people who understand both the problems and the practical constraints of pharmaceutical research. That conversation led to one of our most innovative ideas, a network of current industry researchers who could confidentially report safety concerns to our institute, allowing us to identify systemic problems before they reached the crisis level that had characterized the Blackstone situation. 6 months after Lysander's arrest, we officially launched the Institute for Pharmaceutical Research Integrity, IPRI. Our mission statement was simple: ensuring that pharmaceutical research serves patients first, profits second, and truth always. Our first case came within 2 weeks of our launch. A researcher at a mid-sized biotechnology company contacted us about pressure to suppress adverse event data in a clinical trial for a new diabetes medication. Using the protocols we'd developed, we provided legal protection for the researcher, conducted an independent review of the safety data, and facilitated a resolution that addressed the safety concerns without destroying the researcher's career. The drug was voluntarily withdrawn from FDA review for additional safety testing. No patients were harmed by a potentially dangerous medication. The researcher kept their job and was eventually promoted for their commitment to patient safety. It was exactly the outcome we'd envisioned: systematic change that prevented problems instead of just responding to them after patients had been harmed. But our real measure of success came when pharmaceutical companies began proactively reaching out to us for independent safety reviews. They'd realized that having external validation of their safety procedures was actually good business. It protected them from legal liability and gave them credibility with regulators and patients. What you've created, Martinez-Chan told me during IPRI's 6-month review, is something that benefits everyone except people who want to suppress safety concerns. Companies get better safety outcomes, researchers get protection from retaliation, patients get safer drugs, and regulators get objective data. It's a rare example of a reform that actually works for all the legitimate stakeholders. As I looked around the conference room at IPRI's first annual board meeting, I realized how far I'd come from that devastating day in Lysander's office. I was no longer fighting against a corrupt system, I was building a better one. But more importantly, I wasn't building it alone. The institute had grown to include researchers, advocates, former regulators, and industry reformers who all shared the same commitment to putting patient safety first. We'd transformed from individual victims of corporate retaliation into a movement for systematic change that was already making pharmaceutical research safer for both patients and researchers. The quiet researcher who'd been fired for asking inconvenient questions had become the leader of an organization that was changing how the entire industry thought about safety, accountability, and the responsibility that comes with developing drugs that could save or destroy lives. And we were just getting started. That was 18 months ago. Today, I'm sitting in my office at IPRI headquarters, preparing for a keynote speech at the International Conference on Pharmaceutical Ethics, looking out at a view that would have been unimaginable when I was crying on my apartment floor after being fired for insubordination. The Institute for Pharmaceutical Research Integrity has grown beyond anything we originally envisioned. We now have 43 staff members, partnerships with research institutions in 12 countries, and a track record of successfully protecting over 200 researchers who've reported safety concerns. More importantly, we've prevented an estimated 15 potentially dangerous drugs from reaching the market by providing independent safety reviews that identified problems before patients were harmed. Last month, I received something I never expected, a call from the White House asking me to serve on a presidential task force examining pharmaceutical industry reform. The woman who'd been blacklisted for asking inconvenient questions about patient safety was now being asked to help shape national policy on pharmaceutical research ethics. But the moment that truly showed me how far we'd all come happened 3 weeks ago, in the most unlikely of places. I was leaving a coffee shop in downtown when I nearly collided with someone coming out of the unemployment office next door. When I looked up to apologize, I found myself face to face with Lysander Hayes. He looked diminished. The federal charges had been reduced through a plea bargain, but he'd still served 14 months in prison and was now prohibited from working in pharmaceutical research for life. The man who'd once commanded boardrooms and destroyed careers was wearing a worn suit and carrying a folder of what looked like job applications. "Eira," he said quietly, his voice lacking any of the authority I remembered. I wasn't sure I'd ever see you again. Lysander. I wasn't sure what to feel. Anger seemed pointless now. Satisfaction felt hollow. Mostly, I felt sad for all the patients who'd been harmed and all the researchers who'd been silenced because of decisions he'd made. "I heard about your institute," he continued, glancing nervously around as if afraid someone might see us talking. "About the work you're doing to protect researchers who report safety concerns." "Yes. I want you to know that I've had a lot of time to think about what I did. About the people who were hurt because I prioritized the wrong things." He paused, struggling with words. "I can't undo the harm I caused, but I wanted you to know that what you built, it's important. It's necessary." I studied his face, looking for signs of manipulation or self-serving rhetoric. But what I saw was genuine remorse, and exhaustion, and the recognition that his actions had had consequences far beyond his own career. "The researchers you silenced were trying to save lives," I said simply. "The patients who were harmed by the drugs we could have made safer, they deserved better." "I know," he said. "And I'm sorry. I know that doesn't fix anything, but I needed you to hear it." As I watched him walk away, I realized that this encounter represented the complete transformation of our power dynamic. Lysander Hayes, who'd once held the power to destroy careers and silence inconvenient voices, was now powerless. Meanwhile, I had become the person with the platform and influence to shape industry standards and protect researchers from exactly the kind of retaliation he'd specialized in. But more than that, I understood that my story had evolved beyond personal vindication or even institutional reform. It had become proof that systematic change was possible when people refused to accept that this is just how things work. Last week, I received an email from a young researcher at a biotechnology startup who discovered safety issues in a clinical trial and was being pressured to stay quiet. "Dr. Vance," she wrote, "I heard your story and realized that I don't have to choose between my career and my conscience. I'm reporting the safety concerns, and I'm documenting everything, just like you taught us to do." That email is why I'm making this video. Because somewhere out there, in industries and companies and institutions around the world, there are people who see problems that need to be addressed, who know about dangers that need to be exposed, who understand that systems need to be changed, but who believe they're powerless to make a difference. I want those people to know what I learned during my journey from a terminated researcher to the head of an organization that's changing an entire industry. You're not powerless. You're never powerless when you have truth on your side and the determination to see justice done. Document everything. Build alliances with others who share your values. Think strategically about how to create change, not just how to survive retaliation. And remember that the qualities that make you seem like a threat to corrupt systems, attention to detail, commitment to doing the right thing, refusal to stay silent when people are being harmed, those aren't weaknesses. They're superpowers. If my story has resonated with you, if you're facing similar challenges in your own workplace or industry, please know that you're not alone. Share your experiences in the comments below. I read every single one, and often the connections people make through sharing their stories lead to the alliances that create real change. Hit that like button if this story has inspired you, and subscribe to the channel if you want to hear more stories about people who refuse to accept that systematic injustice was inevitable. And if you know someone who's being pressured to stay silent about problems that could harm people, share this video with them. Sometimes all we need is to see that transformation is possible, that fighting back can work, and that the voices trying to silence us are often much less powerful than they want us to believe. Until next time, this is Dr. Eira Vance, reminding you that the quietest person in the room, the one who's been watching, listening, and documenting everything, might just be the one who changes everything. The system only stays broken when good people decide they're too powerless to fix it. You're not powerless. And it's time to prove it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell, so you don't miss any upload from us.